And I would like to bring up Hayden Reese. That's you.
You don't know if I'm worth applauding, but I appreciate it nonetheless. So it's interesting. She said to turn off our cell phones, and I thought, but what should we turn on? And my suggestion is an open mind. Welcome. Dale asked me to introduce this evening. I met William Stafford in 1992, and several years later I made a film on his friendship with fellow poet Robert Bly. And 3 years ago I returned to Stafford to look at his work and writings and thoughts as a conscientious objector in the Second World War, and I made a second film called Every War Has Two Losers, which was a line from Stafford's journals. Both films are on a DVD, and I even brought a few. Tomorrow will mark the 18th year since Bill left this world. And he was a very special fellow. And I was very happy when I learned that Dale had this deep interest in Stafford and was planning this evening. I want folks to keep the Stafford voice in the air, and such an evening is doing that, so I'm very appreciative that this is happening. Dale asked me to pose a few questions for you prior to the evening to think about. Can good poems provide secret passwords into new, undiscovered places within us? Can the lives of citizens be delighted, even slightly improved, by hearing the right poem at the right time? And can we, when we hear a poem, find ourselves inside the poem, looking out? For Dale, I know these questions would all be answered in the affirmative with gusto. William Stafford, he believes, is a very good place to start many investigations. For the last 7 years, he has been reading a Stafford poem each day, a new form of daily vitamin. Sounds like a good one. So ladies and gentlemen, William Stafford and Me by Dale Byron.
There is a thread you follow. There is a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it does not change. People will wonder what you are pursuing, and you have to explain about the thread. But still, it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Though people will get hurt and die, and you will suffer and grow old. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. There is a thread that you follow. It goes among things that change, but it does not change. People will wonder, what are you doing? What are you pursuing? Ever had anybody ask you that? What are you doing? What are you pursuing? And you have to explain about your thread. But still, it's hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Though people will get hurt and die, and you will suffer and grow old. Nothing we can do can stop time's unfolding. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of your thread. Oh, we're in for some lucky times tonight. We're in for some lucky times, not because we're going to do any kind of hero worship, because I think that's the last thing that he would have been interested in. Just a moment ago when I spilled hot water in the back of the room, Haydn reminded me of how human William Stafford was. He had all his faults. He felt some of his best poetry, by the way, happened when he stumbled, when he made mistakes. And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to go down this trail. We're going to go down this trail, but it's going to be your trail. It's going to be your trail. And he has left for us some, happy surprises and some bonuses. He's left all that stuff for us. There's no doubt about that. And we're going to be working with that. He talked about himself in an essay that he did some years before he died. And he said, he called himself sort of tongue-in-cheek, but not totally tongue-in-cheek. He called himself the priest of the imagination. Priest of the imagination. But what he was talking about was your imagination. Your imagination. Mine. So we're going to be hopping down that trail. In fact, the metaphor I'd like us to work on tonight for this, if you bear with me, is to invite each of us to get down in our bloodhound stance and sniff our way down our trail with some of the things that he's left for us, some of the different guides that he's left for us. So because that's our trail tonight, because this is what our metaphor tonight, this is our hero. This is our hero tonight. William Stafford said there's a whole university in that nose. And so, I was thinking about that. I'm not quite sure if that's a he or a she. But it's definitely a beautiful face. And it's a face that is sort of non-assuming. It's that kind of not pretense kind of face. And that face that he doesn't have to make up anything because you just see the seriousness in that face. And that's the way I think when we set out on our trail, that's how we have to be. In fact, Stafford he thought this kind of swaggering, kind of know-it-all, kind of leader way, this hero way, that swaggering way, he thought not only was that boring and boorish, but he thought it was actually dangerous in a lot of situations. He thought that kind of swaggering hero, in fact, one of the things that he would say is he'd say, one of those swaggering heroes is just somebody that's never met a live one of these. A swaggering type hero is someone who's never met a live lion. Because that puts it into context, doesn't it? It really puts it into context. And I was thinking about this. One of the things that he would say, he'd say, aggressive people do not appeal to me. I yield to them scorched earth. Or he would say, it takes all kind in this world, but there are too many of some kind. Have you noticed? Have you noticed? And so the thing is, though, that tonight in some of the work that we'll look at, some of his poems and writings, I think that he also felt like this kind of creativity was a fierce kind of thing. So how do you tame that? How do you tame that inner fierceness? How do you do that? Moments after this man... No, I'm just kidding. But how do you tame this kind of stuff? Because there's a fierceness. If you're really going to get in touch with your creativity, it goes deep into some dark spaces. It goes deep into some dark spaces. I just was reminded, as one dear friend told me, he says, sometimes my radio channel gets into some really dark spaces and I have to adjust the volume and the channel a little bit. But the thing that, before we sort of get into Stafford's poetry, other than that first one that I said, which is called The Way It Is. Can you imagine? Here's a person who would not have been demonstrative about the way it is, and he wrote a poem called The Way It Is. It's perfect. Just perfect. But the thing that I need to do first, before we go any further, is that I need to confess something. But I brought a prop, and I'm aware that this prop may make some of you nervous in here. But I brought it anyway. We won't use it for long. How many of you went to parochial school? I know you're out. Yeah, I know you're out there. What do they say? Catholics did not invent guilt, but they perfected it. So the thing is that, I have to make a confession because I am what I would call it's really kind of a smallness of character. I am a snob. I'm definitely a snob. But I'm not just the run-of-the-mill. It's not about money or if you see my car, it's not about cars. It's not about any of that stuff. But I am a particular kind of snob. I am a William Stafford snob. And there are some of us out there like that. Now, here's how it shows up for me. Whenever I go into a bookstore or into a library, into a hallowed house of books, and I know, I'm looking at this audience, I know many of you are like me and you love books. You maybe love books too much. You maybe have too many books. And so I love books, but I go into the library and I have this kind of look. It's that look of wonder and amazement, and I go in and I just absolutely, it's really in my DNA. My mother studied Latin when she was in university. You could not go to her and ask her for a word that she did not know the derivative, the etymology, how to say it, everything. She knew everything about it. And so I think the love of books is really in my DNA because I love the way they smell, I love the way they feel, I love the touch of them. In fact, 4 blocks from here is a house that used to be a library. The Mill Valley Library used to be about 3 blocks over here, and it was turned into a house. Can you imagine living in that kind of space? So I love books, but I go into a library, and one of the things that I look and I judge and then I emote, because the first thing that I do is I want to know, what do you imagine I want to know? I go back to the poetry section and I want to know, do they have any William Stafford? And if they don't, now, it's not always like that. It's not always like that. And I can tell you this. Because William Stafford's books, most of them have been out of print for a number of years. As we've already heard, he died in 1993. And because so many of his books have been out of print for so long, often in bookstores, my hopes have been dashed so many times in bookstores that I just expect that I'm going to have this face when I go back there. In fact, I was so happy. We took a trip up through Oregon about 3 months ago. And I couldn't buy it because I already owned 2 of them, but I found a Stafford book. And I walked up to the woman at the cash register and I said, I just want to congratulate you on having the Stafford book. And she looked at me and started speaking to me in this overloud language, right? It was like she didn't quite get the sense of why I was congratulating her. But I love it. And I find oftentimes that libraries will often have William Stafford more than bookstores for a good reason. This one, right up the street from us, this way, has 6 or 7 volumes. But here's the thing. What happens is that my kind of snobbery is complex. And I have to admit this to you. Because what happens to me is that if I go in and I see 5 or 6 Stafford volumes in a library, I think to myself, what's wrong with these people? They haven't checked these books out. And so I have a kind of, a complex snobbery. But if they do, then I get that look. I have that particular look. Now, the thing is that this is a perfect time for me to also share with you another Stafford poem because of that face. And the thing is that I also want to give you a sense of how he used to conduct his readings. Because the way he would do it is this. He would go and he would have a pocket full of poems, as I do, and then he would have a receptacle over here, and he would reach in, he would pull out the poem, and it is the exact one that I meant to pull out, and he would pull it out, And he would then read the poem. This one is called Choosing a Dog. It's love, they say. It's love, they say. If you touch the right one, a whole half of the universe wakes up, a new half. It's love, they say. If you touch the right one, a whole half of the universe wakes up, a new half. Some people never find that half, or they neglect it or trade it for money or success, and it dies. And it dies. The faces of big dogs tell over the years that size is a burden. You enjoy it for a while, but then maintenance gets to you. When I get old, I think I'll keep not a little dog, but a serious dog for the occasional drop-in criminal. My kind of dog, unimpressed by dress or manner, just knowing what's happening by the smell. Your good dogs, some things they don't want you to know. Your good dogs, some things they don't want you to know. They don't want you to know. It's too dreary or ethereal. And sometimes, when they look into the fire, they see time going on and someone alone, but they don't say anything. Your good dogs, some things that they hear, they don't really want you to know. It's too grim or ethereal. It's too grim or ethereal. And sometimes when they look in the fire, they see time going on and someone alone. But they don't say anything. Do you see what he's doing to us here? That is William Stafford perfected. He starts out with this kind of, it's love, they say. You know, that kind of light, it's love, they say. You touch the right one, and a whole half of the universe lights up. A new half. And then we sort of move on into the next area, and there's a little admonition. Not harsh or in your face. He wasn't like that. But he says, some people never find that half. Do you know those people? Some people never find that half, or they neglect it or trade it for money or success, and it dies. And it dies. And then he goes back and he gives us that little line, you know, that kind of funny line. When I get old, I think I'll keep not a little dog, but a serious dog for the occasional drop-in criminal. And then he comes back. And he comes back and talks to us in a way, I don't know what he's saying there. But there's some feeling when I get down to those lines. And sometimes when they look into the fire, they see time going on and someone alone. But they don't say anything. That's your good dog. And then I take this, I start moving around like crazy. Because, see, what I do is I start moving around and I start thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe he was talking about poetry. And I start thinking, your good poem, some things they don't want you to experience, like boredom. They don't really want you to know that. It's too grim or ethereal. So, I mean, for me, it's speaking to me on so many different levels. And I think to myself that, you know, a good poem has always, for me, had gifts for the head, ideas, for the heart, feeling, and for, as the Japanese say, hara, which means the center of your physical and spiritual body. Gifts for the head and the heart and the hara. Bless you. And so I imagine that Stafford knew these kinds of things. I also, you know, one of the things that occurs to me about poetry is you cannot force a poem to do anything. If you try to force a poem to do something it doesn't want to do. You cannot force a poem to do anything it doesn't want to do. But once it does it, you can't stop it. So I thought to myself tonight, How do we hold William Stafford? How do we do that? How do we capture this guy who had, Stafford said at one point, he says, I've written so many poems I ran out of titles. He said I had to name some of them by the same title. And so how do we hold a guy like that? And I thought, well, I want to hold Stafford just like I was holding that chard in my organic garden 3 years ago. You should have been there. It was good. It was really good. But I want to hold Stafford in that way. And I thought to myself, well, what we've got to do then is we've got to get back to that thread. There is a thread you follow. There is a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it does not change. You know what your thread is. Some people may be trying to get you to forget it, but you know what your thread is. You know what it is. So I was thinking that's how we would do it. And we put everything in there. Joys, hurts, pleasure, grief, old tires, shark's bellies. Everything goes into the poem. With this thread theory, there was a kind of way in which that really speaks to so much of Stafford's life. Robert Bly used to tell a story about William Stafford. He said Stafford had this golden thread theory. And Stafford's feeling was that you could take any piece of thread, the slightest idea, the slightest thing, and you could begin to follow that thread. He said, you don't pull on it too hard because it will break. Stafford once says, being too conscientious about poetry is worse than ignoring it. So you take that thread and you move with it, very gentle, like starting a car on ice with a clutch. You know how to do that? That's not a skill we have anymore, is it? But you know what I'm talking about, that easy kind of way that you ease into it. And Bly asked him, he said, Bill, he said, you can't mean any thread, do you? You can't mean any thread, because you always talk about any thread will start a poem for you. You must mean that you love some threads better than others. And Stafford said, any thread. Any thread. In fact, if you start turning any of your ideas away, eventually even your bad ones will stop coming. Something to think about. By the way, Mary Oliver used to talk about, she would say, you have a date with your muse, whatever it is. Not just writing, any creativity. You have a date with your muse. Don't break that date. You break it once, that's okay. You'll be forgiven. Twice, maybe. 3 times, okay. But you start breaking that date, the muse says, you're not serious. You are not serious. That's okay. You can be forgiven. Just start doing it. Okay. So, the thread. Now, you would accept anything. You would even accept somebody putting a line of your poem. Have you ever seen a poem on a billboard? There is a line of Stafford poetry in front of a Taco Bell. Now that's something about the sublime and I don't know what that is. But anyway, but somebody loved that poetry so much that they put a line from you reading this, be ready. And he said, starting here, what do you want to remember? Starting here, what do you want to remember? The way sunlight creeps across the shining floor? What scent of old wood hovers? What softened sound from outside fills the air? Will you ever bring a better gift to the world than the breathing respect you carry everywhere you go right now? Are you waiting for time to show you some better thoughts? Starting here, when you turn around, lift this new glimpse you have found. Carry into evening all that you want from this day, this interval you've spent hearing or listening to this. Keep it for life. Keep it for life. What can anyone give you greater than now? Starting right here in this room when you turn around. What can anyone give you greater than now? Starting right here in this room when you turn around. One of the most haunting lines in that poem for me is the one where he says, "Are you waiting for time to show you some better thoughts?" As someone who loves to obsess about just about anything, I just imagine that I am waiting. We are waiting for something, waiting for life to be perfect, waiting for something. I'm not quite sure. What can anyone give you greater than now? Starting right here in this room when you turn around. But back to our search. Back to our search. Now remember, we're down in our bloodhound stance. And we're trying to imagine this guy, this William Stafford guy. And he was totally trackable. There's pictures of him up there. There's all his kids. Corny family tree, right? There's all his kids. There's Bill Stafford with his wife Dorothy. There's Stafford in the internment camps. We'll talk about that in a little while. There he is a little bit later. There he is with his trusty dog, teaching with his son Kim, who's an amazing human being, an amazing writer in his own right. And so there's all those pictures of Stafford. He's totally trackable. Totally trackable. We know that he had rituals, he had themes, he had values, he did things over and over again, and he was totally untrackable. One of his books was called Smoke's Way. Smoke's Way. He was totally untrackable, full of paradox, full of conundrum, full of difficulty. And he was all of those things at the same time. All of those things at the same time. You know, I wondered sometimes, I don't know if you all have this feeling. Sometimes I have this feeling that I have to actually look at my feet occasionally to see what I believe in. Because I may say something, but my feet are going to show me really what I'm interested in. So when I watched my feet, I noticed that I was attracted to Stafford for 2 or 3, 4 years before I even understood it. And one of the things that I realized after I read more about him was that I had studied a martial art called Aikido for about 15 years until my body gave out. But I studied Aikido, and Aikido was everything about Smoke's Way. Aikido was this weird martial art that said, if anyone gets hurt, you failed. You know, most martial arts are, if you get hurt, that's your fault. You know, you attacked me. But Aikido is this crazy idea that nobody can get hurt, that the violence has to be stopped. It's Smoke's Way. It's the water way. And that's what Stafford was about. So much of his stuff was about that. In fact, there's a quote here that I want to read that Kim Stafford, who was so helpful, has been so helpful. Stafford's son, so helpful, second son. Kim Stafford said about his dad, pacifism shaped his politics, intuition his writing. So his pliant approach to life, which he called Smoke's Way, shaped his teaching and his parenting. His devotions were victory through surrender. Victory, that's Aikido. Victory through surrender. Eloquence through listening. And becoming a man through understanding the ways of women. Strength through pliability is the paradoxical source of his character, said his son. Keep sniffing with me. William Stafford, who are you? We know that he was a laborer because he was born in the middle of he came of age in the Great Depression. He worked at some really strange jobs. Oil fields, picking. I mean, he did all kind of weird stuff. He worked in an oil field, and they knew that if a hammer sparked, that was the end of everybody, because there were so many fumes in the air. And what's interesting is later in his life, when he would do a resume, he would talk about those jobs before he would talk about the highfalutin writing stuff, or before he'd ever talk about his PhD, or before he ever talked about that he was poet laureate for the United States. I mean, he would talk about this stuff forever. He was a trickster coyote, and I hope you're already starting to get that feel a little bit. He was also a pacifist. He was a Native American, if you go back a few generations. He was a poet, of course. He was a teacher, an amazing teacher. He was a genius. And he was the priest, as we said, of the imagination. So I thought to myself, look, how are we going to do this? How can we do this? This guy is such a right-brained poet kind of a guy. How am I going to do him justice? And I said, oh, perfect, Eureka. What I will do is I will use Smoke's Way. I will sneak up and I'll say, how are we going to talk about a poet with numbers? Perfect. 1914. That was the year that he was born. That was the year that he was born. And he was born at the cusp of World War I. And that had all sorts of implications. He was born in a little town called Hutchinson, Kansas. And he would Kansas would never leave his imagination. It would never leave his imagination. In fact, his son Kim told me that was such a huge kind of thing in their childhood, that they would totally go back to Kansas, and Kansas was always the example for everything. They went there back to visit their folks or relatives, and they came back, and one of the neighbors asked Bill Stafford, says, "Bill, let me ask you a question. Was it flat back there, or was it beautiful?" Well, he winced, because to him, flat was beautiful. Flat was absolutely beautiful. He loved Kansas, even though he could have never, ever, ever gone back there. He would have never been accepted back there in Hutchinson, Kansas. But he loved it. In fact, one of the things that he talked about was in his family of origin, there was this thing where they would do this. He called it later for his kids, talking reckless. And he'd say, since we're talking reckless, and the idea was you could just sort of go for it. The idea was that if we were talking reckless, that you could say whatever you needed to say to let off steam. Not be hurtful, because the person wouldn't be around. This would be strategic gossip. In fact, he learned so much. One of his Aunt Madge, who is, I think, the genesis of this talking recklessly, said, "Some people are so boring you get tired of them even when they aren't around." You know anybody like that? So he also, back in those days, he met his wife, Dorothy, and they both loved the writer Willa Carter. And so basically, one would quote a line and the other would finish it. One would quote a line and the other would finish it. And so after about 3 weeks, Stafford said to Dorothy, "Shouldn't it always be this way?" They were married not too long after that. So, and speaking of this period, so there's his dad and his mother. There's his dad and his mother. And one of the things that was interesting about him was that people would say, well, who's the writer? Who's the most famous writer that's influenced you in your life? And he would always say his mother. He would always say his mother. In fact, one of the things that he talked about is he said that his mother, my mother and I agree. He says, life is inexplicable, and those masterful people who base their lives on confidence and explanation deserve our sympathy. Smoke's way. Smoke's way. You hold things very lightly. You hold it very lightly. One of the things that I was thinking about preparing this had me think about my own mother. And I thought about one of her, some of her sayings. Two of them that came to mind was, bloom where you're planted. You ever heard that one? Bloom where you're planted. She was like that. My younger sister said, I think she gathered up sunlight so that she could spread it back around. And she also would say things like, she said, people who need the most love are the hardest to love. Have you noticed that one? So I was thinking about my mother. The other thing that she used to do, of course, the area of the world is getting beat to death right now with that big storm where I grew up. She would say we'd be out on the beach, we wouldn't have 2 dimes to rub together. We'd down there in our old station wagon to get sunburnt one week a year. Anybody relate to that? So anyway, she would just stop action. She'd say, wonder what the poor people are doing today. So, it was very interesting also that I heard there was a story about Robert Bly, or that Robert Bly tells about Stafford. When his father, when Stafford was about 9 or 10 years old with his dad, and they were out and they were looking for birds. I think they were looking for hawks. And so here they are, and the dad leaned down to young 9 or 10-year-old Bill Stafford and said, Bill, if you listen really carefully and look, you may see the hawk first. Robert Bly said, that's how you turn your son into a poet. If you listen carefully, you might see it first. None of this competitive stuff. His father carried poems in his pocket all the time. Loved writing. One of the things that would happen in the Stafford family is a new book would come in from the library and they'd be all just at each other to see who would get to read it first. That's Bill Stafford, the tall one. That's his sister, Peg, his brother, Bob. And speaking of children, quite a get-up, isn't it? I think that was back in the days when they used to color pictures in. You notice that? Bill Stafford wrote a poem for his daughter called With Kit, age 7, at the beach. We would climb the highest dune, from there to gaze and then come down. The ocean was performing. We contributed our climb. What should our gaze mean? Kit waited for me to decide. Standing on such a hill, what would you tell your child? That was nearly a perfect vista. Those waves raced far and cold. How far could you swim in such a storm, Daddy? As far as was needed, I said. As far as was needed. And as I talked, I swam. We would climb the highest dune, from there to gaze and then come down. The ocean was performing. We contributed our climb. What should our gaze mean? Kit waited for me to decide. Standing on such a hill, what would you tell your child? Those waves raced far and cold. That was nearly a perfect vista. How far could you swim in such a storm, Daddy? As far as was needed, I said. As far as was needed. And as I talked, I swam. Robert Bly said that's the most important poem ever written by a parent to a child. I don't know. It's a wonderful poem. Stafford treated that poem different than most all of his poems. Kim told me, his son told me, that was a poem that he revised over and over and over again all his life. He did not do that with most poems. He did not do that with hardly any poems, but he did it with that one. He loved that poem. His other daughter, when she found out, of course, about this poem, she said, "Daddy, write one for me." So he started one. He says, "In prison, they sometimes give you the best room." He was fierce and not always predictable. But I imagine that poem, and I begin to think of that poem for each of us tonight in this room, because I believe, see, what I do is I take these poems and I take them literally and metaphorically and all that kind of stuff, and I believe that that poem could also be talking about some part of you talking to some other part of you. And I hope that each of you, all of us, me, all of you, have a part of you that is willing to protect the parts of you that need protecting. And so when I hear those words, how far could you swim? I hope that you can answer. I hope that part of me can answer, as far as was needed, I said. As far as was needed. And as I talked, I swam. As I talked, I swam. Bill by the numbers. That's the number of wars that he fought in. He was not showy with his pacifism. He was not showy with it. He let his feet do the talking for him. Now, I really respect that. He was not demonstrative about it. He was not showy. He let his feet do the talking. And one of the interesting things is there's a story that he went in front of the draft board, and the person who had taught Sunday school in Kansas was the head of the draft board, and the guy looked at him in a kind of menacing way and said, "Bill, how did you ever get this idea to be a pacifist? Where did you get that idea from?" He said, "You taught me to never kill. I didn't forget." Done. Done. He spent 4 years in the internment camps. And that's where he started his writing habit. He got up at 4 a.m. every morning to write. 4 a.m. every morning. If you're a poet, eventually you'll become a word nerd. And so one of the ideas that I like to imagine about the word or the phrase self-discipline really means to be a disciple unto yourself. Self-discipline. And he had incredible self-discipline. Now, he ranged far when he allowed himself incredible freedom, but he always showed up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do his writing. One of his daughters thought that Daddy was lonely. So she started getting up. "I'm going to help Daddy." 4 o'clock in the morning, she started getting up. Well, Smoke's way, he didn't want to, he didn't want to do that. He just kept getting up earlier. About 3 o'clock, she gave up. And that was the end of it. But he didn't have to tell her. He didn't have to say anything about that. The other thing, too, he was famous for taking naps, by the way. And maybe that was, because I asked him once, I said, "Look, he got up so early. How did he make that work? Did he go to bed at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock? He said, no, he went to bed more normal time, but he took naps. In fact, he was famous he taught at Lewis and Clark University up in Portland. He was famous for, if a staff meeting went over any time, if it was supposed to be 30 minutes, if it went 35 minutes, he'd lay down in the back room and go to sleep. Just did it. That was his way. He said that he once said, he says, "I have the bitter habit of the forlorn cause. That is my addiction." There was a story about him that was told, again by, I think, Robert Bly. I heard him tell this story. He said that he had come home, and there was some other kids taunting this black kid. And his mother was hearing the story, and his mom said, "Well, Bill, what did you do? What did you do?" And he said, I went and stood with him. He stood with him. And that was something that he started in those days. There was a famous quote of his. I love this. Somebody was talking to him about pacifism doesn't work, and how does this happen, and pressing him. And he said, "Look," he said, "I can't stop war. Jesus couldn't stop war. Eisenhower couldn't stop war. But at least I could decide there would be one person not in it." It was a bad war to sit out. It was not a good war. Stafford would sometimes talk about, again, he always thought that if you raised your voice, you'd already lost the argument, which is Aikido. He who has the mind to fight has already lost. If you raise your voice, you're done. But he would talk about, in this time, he would tell a teaching story. He'd say, look, there's a kind of false and hollow now. There's a kind of now that's not really now. And he'd say, so a little thought experiment now. Imagine that you're on a ship. And imagine that it's a huge ship, and but it have to be a deep harbor. But let's say that you're about 200 or 300 feet off the shore, or 200 or 300 yards, doesn't matter. And you're going 35 knots. As much as I know about ships, that's fast. That's about 40 miles an hour. And let's say somebody said, "Here, you take the wheel." The ship is going to hit the land. It's going to crash. He would call that the specious now. And what's interesting is we wouldn't say about the ship, we wouldn't say, well, that's just the way ships are. So one of the things that he would talk about, he said, let's go back. Let's go back to, 10 miles offshore where we could actually change the thing. Let's go back to the 30s where we could actually change something in Europe or help or do something. You know what I'm saying? Let's go back, because the specious now is the kind of thing where the great physicist used to say the mind makes up the world. David Bohm, the mind makes up the world and then claims it did not. If you are 300 feet from the shore and somebody hands you the wheel, you have got no chance to not hit the shore. But what about 10 miles before? What about 20 miles before? There's a story about Stafford when he was in the internment camps. He said, it takes a whole series of bad moves and bad luck to almost get killed by your fellow countrymen. But it almost happened to him. He was in town, and he was doing this. They would get leave, like soldiers. They would get leaves occasionally. And they were in town, and they were reading and having drinks coffee or whatever they were doing, and they were sitting outside. Well, this crowd started coming around them. Now, the negative, the pejorative term for a conscientious objector, it may still be this. It was called conkies in those days. And they were going, there are conkies here. And so they started going around them, and they started getting a little bit rough. The crowd was starting to get a little boisterous. And they were demanding that Stafford give them his notes. And somehow or another, the police finally arrived and saved them, but before there was about 15 minutes when it looked like they were going to be lynched or something really bad was going to happen to them, beat up bad. They did not do that. Stafford did not give them his notes, and he did not run. Smokes away. Smokes away. That's a title of a poem. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, then a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For there are many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break. Sending with shouts, the terrible airs of childhood storming out to play through the broken dikes. And as elephants parade, holding each elephant's tail. But if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel. I call it cruel. And maybe the root of all cruelty to know what happens, but to not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to a shadowy voice, to a remote region in all who talk. Though we could fool each other, we should consider lest the mutual parade of our lives get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give to each other, yes, no, or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. Kim Stafford tells another story about his dad. They were driving out in the Oregon boonies and had a flat tire. And his car's going like that. It's front tire and it's not good. Kim's wife was here. Kim was driving. Bill Stafford was in the back. His dad was in the back. And his dad said, "Attaboy." He's going, "Attaboy, you're steering good." You know, he's forever the kind of promoter. So he's telling his son, he's telling Kim that. So Kim got the thing off the road. And as Kim tells the story, he says, "Well, my dad let me be the hero. He let me change the tire." Smokes away. But what happened is they had the tire jacked up. You guys remember those? Do you remember those old jacks? You know, the kind with the metal thing, you know, it was back when you didn't just call AAA, you know. So you're jacking the thing up like that, you know, and they had the tire off. They were in a bad way in terms of vulnerability. In the distance, around, they could hear, couldn't see yet, but they could hear in the distance this incredible rumbling sound, very intimidating. Motorcycles. This whole kind of parade of Hell's Angels come. And they come right beside the car. They've filled the whole lane up. They come right beside the car and they stop and they sneer in the way that Hell's Angels, only they can. Kim said, "I got to admit, I didn't know what to do. I was scared out of my mind." He says, "I gussied up over the car, grabbed a tire iron. I had it beside me." He says, "I didn't know what to do. There's too many of them. I didn't know what to do." His dad walked around the car and he stood like this, I imagine. He stood like this. He stood sort of back on one. You know, this is the same stance of Aikido. So he stood just about like this, and he stood like that, and he just sort of had his weight on that back hip. And it's that look, it says, "I'm not going to fight, and I'm not going to run, and I'm not going to do anything stupid. I'm just here." They left. They left. Okay, this is good news for all of us who've decided to be more creative in, let's say, as not as children. Because William Stafford was 46 years old when he published his first book of poems. So I'm here to tell you, you don't have to be a kid to be creative. And many of his best poems he wrote in the last 5 years of his life, I think. Now, maybe I'm biased. I think so. Now, one of the other things that I found that I have in common with Bill Stafford, because his writings are completely filled with aphorisms. You can't imagine how much somebody can write in 50 years of getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Oh my God. So he wrote and he wrote and he wrote and he had aphorisms all through his stuff. Well, the reason I related to that is because having grown up in the South, While you guys were studying algebra, we were studying old sayings, homilies. And so he has tons of homilies, and it reminded me of, there is yours truly in my manly man stance at about 8 or 9 years old. And there's my dad with our faithful dog, Blackie, who raided the Mr. Pigs up the street all the time for bones. And there we were in a place that is getting beaten like crazy. That's where we were on the shore in where it's so crazy right now. So there we were. Now the thing is that some of my aphorisms, one of my favorite is, even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while. It's good for writing too. It gives you a lot of permission to do that. So Stafford would say to the rich business tycoons, he'd say, don't give it away, give it back. To all of us, he'd say, we can learn and know and still not understand. To writers, he could say, language can do what it cannot say. Language can do what it cannot say. Have you noticed? A poem is just words that got lucky. To the dedicated, he'd say, look, it's legitimate to crawl once your wings are broken. With the kind of causes he took up. To braggarts, he'd say, off a high place, it is a courtesy to let others go first. And he'd say to all of us, he'd say, the greatest ownership of all is to look around and to understand. To look around and to understand. So, all good citizens, be of hope. One of the things that he said was, he said that if you get stuck, and I'm going to tell you tonight, not about writing, fill in your art or activity, but he would say, if you get stuck while writing, just lower your standards and keep on going. It was all about permission. All about permission. And this was sort of a conundrum too, because he was an amazing writer, won all kind of awards, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, Bill by the numbers, 50. That's the years he wrote every day. He wrote for 50 years. Started in the internment camp, as we said. Can you imagine doing anything? Okay. That, in addition to his pen, that was his other favorite writing tool. He did all of his writing reclined on a couch. He'd look out the window, he'd get an idea, and he'd start writing. He'd just start writing. You know what he said about editors? He says, editors are my friends. They keep me from publishing bad stuff. There's old William Stafford laying on the couch. That was his favorite tool. 20,000, that's the number of pages he created during his morning sessions. Can you imagine? I was just in the archives, about 3, the William Stafford archives. They're just barely, they're like up to here, 20,000 pages. I wanted to see them all. No, I didn't. I couldn't see them all, but they're going through them right now. It's amazing, amazing place up there. 20,000 pages. In 1978, at 75 years of age, William Stafford's oldest son committed suicide. And he had 4 children. This was his oldest son, Brett. And he committed suicide. There's a whole story behind it about the troubles that he was having. But you can imagine the kind of, you can imagine. So he wrote a poem about it at some point. A memorial, son Brett. In the way you went, you were important. In the way you went, you were important. I do not know what you found. I do not know what you found. In the pattern of my life, you stand where you stood always, in the center, a hero, a puzzle, a man. What you might have told me, I will never know. The lips went still, the body cold. I am afraid in the circling stars, in the dark, and even at noon in the light. When I run, what am I running from? When I run, what am I running from? You turned once to tell me something, but then you glimpsed a shadow in my face. You turned once to tell me something, but then you glimpsed a shadow on my face. And maybe you thought, why tell what hurts? Why tell what hurts? You carried it, my boy, so brave and so far. Now we have all the days, and the sun goes by the same. There is a faint wandering trail I find sometimes off through grass and sage. I stop and listen. Only summer again. Remember the bees, the wind. Now we have all the days, and the sun goes by the same. There is a faint wandering trail I find sometimes off through grass and sage. I stop and listen. Only summer again. Remember the bees, the wind. Kim Stafford told me, it was in the book that he wrote about his dad, which is a wonderful book called Early Mornings. And Kim talked about, he asked his dad some years later, what was that like for him? And he said that it was excruciating. It was the most terrible time in his entire life. And Bill Stafford had a difficult time supporting the others in his family at that time. He was a very supportive person, but he had difficulty during that time being supportive to others in his family. And it was a very, very difficult and dark time. And he continued to write, and he continued to live and to organize his life in addition to that deep hurt that he had had. In addition to not being able to, his son had been going through Great Depression and had trouble in all areas of his life. So it was a very tragic story. But it was one that he began to pull into his writing, and he began to, and he continued to live. He continued to live. Every life has tragedy in it. Bill by the numbers, 7,000. That's the number of poems he wrote. Can you imagine? I already told you that he wrote so many poems he ran out of titles, he said. He said, let's face it, poetry will always be a wild animal. And he would say also that, he just loved writing. Somebody would say, Bill, what is your favorite poem? Get a twinkle in his eye, and he'd say, the one I haven't written yet. I'd give them all away for the one I haven't written yet. 7,000 poems he wrote. He didn't publish all those, but he wrote them. Now, I wouldn't be doing you any justice tonight if I didn't give you a full sense of his coyote nature. He definitely had a coyote spirit. And he wrote a poem. I happen to have it. This is what he would do. Now, I didn't mention this, but Bill Stafford only put poems on one half of a piece of paper. He was very economical. And he from one pocket to the other. But because of my eyesight, I'm being luxurious and going for a whole page. The Star in the Hills. The Star in the Hills. A star hit. Oh, by the way, he lived in California during the time he wrote this poem, taught at San Jose State. Bill Stafford actually lived in Mill Valley for a very short time, wrote at least one poem here. Well, of course he did. He wrote poems every day. The Star in the Hills. A star hid in the hills behind our house, up where the grass turns brown, touching the sky. Meteors have hit the world before, but this was near and since TV. Few saw, but many felt the shock. The state of California owns that land, and out from shore 3 miles. And any stars that come will be roped off and viewed from 8 to 5. A guard who took the oath of loyalty and denied any police record told me this. If you don't have a police record yet, you could take the oath and get a job if California should be hit by another star. I'd promise to be loyal to California and to guard any stars that hit it, I said, or any place 3 miles out from shore. Unless the star was bigger than the state, in which case I'd be loyal to it. But that guard, he said no exceptions were allowed. And he leaned against the state-owned meteor, so calm, and puffed a cork-tipped cigarette that I looked down and traced in the dust and thought again, okay, any star. That boy. We are getting close to the time of last words, my last words, and also William Stafford's last words. You heard that it's really interesting. For some reason, I didn't really think of this fully, but you know today is the 27th, and tomorrow is the 28th, which is the anniversary of his death. He died on August 28th. Now, he had some last words on the day that he died. He did have some. He had a lot of them. Some of them are sort of straight, and some of them are mysterious. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Now, what do you think he did the morning that he died? He got up at 4 o'clock, and he wrote some letters. He wrote a poem. I'm going to share with you. And he wrote some other notes and did some different things. Now, the literal words that he said just before he died was, better get another spatula. That's poet laureate, right? 7,000 poems. He checks out by saying, better get another spatula. He was helpful to the end. He was helpful to the end. He was making some pancake batter with his wife, and the spatula broke, splattering stuff around, and so that was and he died of a heart attack. Fixing breakfast, because, see, his rhythm was get up at 4 o'clock, walk, come back, lay on the couch, write poems, letters, etc., etc. His wife, Dorothy, would get up about 7 o'clock, and he'd help her fix breakfast. That was his rhythm. So those were his literal last words. Now, he had some mysterious ones too, though. See, they had converted his garage into a writing studio for him. And so they were there the next day. Dorothy and the 3 kids were there looking through his stuff, and they found the poem. They found his daily writing. He had actually put his daily writings right where he always put it, in this box, and it was ready for this. He just had his mow down. You know, he knew what he was doing. So when they were looking at the papers, they heard, the kids hear this, and it was their mother, it was Dorothy. And she had seen something on the table or on his desk. And she goes, oh, Bill. Oh, Bill. He had written, and all my love, on the back of a letter that he was answering, and all my love. And the kids were going, you know, all the grown kids, you know, the 2 daughters and Kim, and they said, well, Mom, what's the deal? And she said, well, he only said that one other time in his life. He only wrote that one other time in his life. And it was years ago, before any of you were born, it was years ago. We were having a hard time. We had no money. It was difficult. Everything was hard. And he had gotten up really early to go do something. He cut an apple in half. He ate half the apple and left half the apple for me. And on a note, he put, "And all my love." They looked at each other and they said, "Did he know? Did he know?" And as I mentioned to you, he wrote a poem that day. You decide what he knew. I'll read it for you, just like he did, right? Out of this pocket, it's going in this one. The poem was called, "Are You Mr. William Stafford?" August 28th, 1993, last poem he ever wrote, 3 hours before he died. "Are you Mr. William Stafford?" He repeats the line in the poem. "Are you Mr. William Stafford?" "Yes, but..." "Well, it was yesterday. Sunlight used to follow my hand. And that's when the strange siren-like sound flooded over the horizon and rushed through the streets of our town. That's when sunlight came from behind a rock and began to follow my hand. It's for the best," my mother said. "Nothing can ever be wrong for anyone truly good." So later the sun settled back and the sound faded and was gone. All along the streets, every house waited, white, blue, gray. Trees were still trying to arch as far as they could. You can't tell when strange things with meaning will happen. You can't tell when strange things with meaning will happen. I'm still here writing it down just the way it was. You don't have to prove anything, my mother said. Just be ready for what God sends. I listened and put my hand out in the sun again. It was all easy. It was all easy. Well, it was yesterday, and the sun came. Why? It came. Well, it was yesterday, and the sun came. Why? It came. He would often write at the end of his letters, he would sign them adios. That's the way he signed his letters. And he wrote to everybody that wrote him. Everybody. Incredibly generous. I'm so jealous of anybody that met him. But I know a lot about him. Naomi Shihab Nye, who is an incredible poet, loved William Stafford. William Stafford loved her writing. They were good friends the last 5+ years of his life. She was incredibly helpful, amazingly generous with this project for me. And she wrote one time, she said, "The day I found his poems was a lucky day, and every day thereafter." So many kind people that have helped and supported in this, many in this very room. Now, look, I could only cover a fraction of the poems that I love. If you had any idea the angst of trying to whittle down 7,000 poems to 8. But if you, in your sniffing capacity tonight, if you have sniffed down the trail and found something that you maybe has been of a little interest to you, I would absolutely encourage you to sniff on down that trail a little bit further. Now, the thing I want to say is that in doing this process, yes, I used PowerPoint. And every time I would do a new revision, and add something, or a picture, or a poem, or a new something or another, that program would come back and would say to me over and over and over again, PowerPoint is saving William Stafford and me. I can only hope, my deepest, deepest hope, is that each of you found some little glimpse of something tonight that will save you. Thank you for coming.